I'm Brett with J&G Transmissions. Today we're going to be talking about some of the most common mistakes made when installing a transmission. First, we're going to start with cooler lines and what to look for and what to watch out for when you're reinstalling the transmission. So on this particular vehicle, we're working on a Pathfinder here. These have what's called a banjo style fitting on them. So there's a bolt that goes through these fittings that screws into the side of the transmission, and on each side of these bolts there's going to be a copper washer that goes on each side of this fitting. One real common thing that we see on these is when people reinstall the transmissions, they use the old copper washers, and when you tighten down the bolts on these things, it actually smashes those washers, and they kind of take form to the bolt on each side of these fittings. And if you reuse the old ones, very common for them to start leaking because they've already been smashed down one time and they never get that same seal again. So it's very important, especially on this style of fitting, not to reuse the copper washers and put new ones on them. When we build these transmissions, if it's a transmission that we're sending out that you're installing, we always send new washers out with them, so make sure to use the new washers. The other thing that we see quite often on the cooler lines, I have some other cooler lines that are not off of this particular vehicle. I'll show you what to look out for on these. So these particular cooler lines come off of a Dodge diesel pickup truck. And it's very common on these cooler lines. You can see how caked on the grease and everything is on these. Where these vulcanized or these crimped fittings are, quite often from all the heat and then getting cold and heat and cold and the temperature of the fluid going through these, they will start leaking out of these vulcanized fittings here. So it's very important to check these, clean the hoses up a little bit when you're tearing them down. Wipe them down and make sure that you don't have any leakage, because we often see a cooler line may not be leaking when the vehicle comes in. You take it off, you manipulate that cooler line around a little bit, you move it, all of a sudden you hook things back up, and quite often you have a small drip up to a very large leak, and it's obviously a lot easier to explain to a customer before you have it reinstalled or before they have to bring it back that, you know, their cooler lines are looking pretty questionable, and there's signs of leaking, and, you know, installing the transmission when you're doing the new one would be a good time to put those new cooler lines in. We often see, quite often, on transmissions that are installed, like I say, we see them come back in with cooler line leaks. On a lot of these older vehicles, they have all steel cooler lines that go the full length of the car. Obviously, with the salt and the conditions that we have here in Utah, and then the extreme heat, it takes a huge toll on metal cooler lines and rubber cooler lines. So quite often you'll see those, they'll actually rot through. So those are a few things to look at with cooler lines, and just, you know, make sure when you're installing a new transmission or a remanufactured transmission, take a close look at where those vulcanized fittings are on the cooler lines and where they join together, and make sure everything's good and clean, and all the rubber and everything is good on the cooler lines.